Welcome to Faith and Politics, a show dedicated to discussing issues surrounding the intersection of church, state, and politics, and the examination of whether you're allowing your faith to shape your politics or are your politics starting to shape your faith. In other words, what do you do when God and government come face to face? I'm your host, Orland Johnson. Let me introduce you to our panelists for today. First, we have Mr. Todd McFarland, Deputy General Counsel for the General Conference of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. We have Mr. Tim Schultz, who's the president of the First Amendment Partnership. We have Mr. Wang, who's the General Counsel of the North Pacific Union Conference of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. And we also have Dr. Timothy Golden, who's a professor of philosophy at Whitman College. Gentlemen, great having you on again. Looking forward to our conversation. You know, Meta CEO Mark Zuckerberg was recently reporting the fact that he was receiving pressure from the White House to censor Facebook content. Is one of those type of things that we as Christians have to say that there is nothing truly neutral in the public square. You know, to some degree, this is deeply disturbing, and knowing that we have what I would call politics at the highest level pressuring social media, you know, at one point in life, I wouldn't have been concerned about it. But I think we're almost at a point where social media and Facebook and those type of platforms seem to have more power and even more of a touch than even what goes on nightly news. Interestingly, Zuckerberg reported this activity to Jim Jordan, who's a congressman that obviously does not, quote unquote, get along very well with the left side of politics. But on one hand, we have Zuckerberg saying, hey, I don't like the idea of being pressured. But on the other hand, we as Christians have to be careful in knowing that when these type of activities happen, do we have to stand up and do something about it as well? You know, Tim Golden, when you see this type of activity taking place, where you see the CEO of a major social media operation saying, I'm getting pressure from the White House and the President of the United States regarding issues of how I should report, does that make you uncomfortable? Or is this just simply, that's the world we live in right now?
It does make me uncomfortable because we shouldn't be in the business of having our chief executive put pressure on private entities about things that they do and say. One of the best things about our lives is technology, and one of the most regrettable things about our lives is technology. I do think that social media companies have a responsibility to ensure that what they report is true and accurate, and the things that they allow people to see are true and accurate, because after all, the truth does matter. One of the fallouts of the proliferation of technology is that we now live in a world where people get most of their news from social media. And if you only have a sphere of influence, whether they're called friends or followers, and these people are people who happen to agree with you, and if the content is inaccurate, then or partisan, right, then you're continually reinforcing your misunderstanding of the world, right? So we live in these silos. And I think government needs to do something about it. We've certainly heard from this on the right, right? The far right has often complained that social media has censored much of their content and much of their messages. So, but I think the proper way to engage in this regulation is not with pressure from the White House, it's with congressional action. So if Congress decides to act, then they can do what they do. And ultimately, the Supreme Court, since Marbury versus Madison, will review acts of Congress to determine if they are, in fact, constitutional and consistent with notions of free speech and other cherished rights that we have. So pressure from the White House, no. Congressional action, yes. Supreme Court review, yes. That's the way to do it.
You know, Tim Schultz, when I think about this, living in the best of times and living in the worst of times as it relates to social media, But in the same breath, we're talking about a private organization that I would believe that their number one priority is not getting the news right, but probably making the most money they can for their shareholders. Can you actually really try to get Congress to codify a way to make sure that truth is happening when maybe truth doesn't actually make money?
I think this is really complicated because if you think about the reach of social media companies, especially Facebook, I mean, they have a lot more reach than even something like the New York Times, right? They have reach, and that means political actors are going to work the refs. And they're going to try to get their versions of stories out there. And in this case, it's actually kind of complicated because there was this whole trove of stuff on Facebook promoting quack theories around COVID, quack ways of treating COVID that would just lead people to risk their lives. And I think you've got to expect public health authorities to try in certain ways to make sure that that stuff isn't out there. Just the question really is when does working the refs lapse into threatening the refs? Because when you're calling from the White House, sometimes working the refs and saying, hey, you guys shouldn't be having that stuff up there. That's quacky. That's going to risk people's lives. That can lapse into an implied threat. So that's where this gets really tricky. I mean, I think we should expect government officials, not just with a New York Times reporter who may be getting a story wrong, or an editor, where a political actor is going to call that editor and say, you guys really messed this story up. I think the size and influence of social media companies means it's inevitable that they're going to get calls like that. I just think it's a question of whether those calls shade from working the refs into threatening the refs, behind the gym after the game.
I think, Orlin, the other challenge, too, is, it sounds good to only add factual information, but what is that factual information? Determining that is almost impossible. Take the COVID situation. Was this a lab-derived, a lab-leaked virus, right? That was at one point considered to be, basically racist fake news and was being banned, and Facebook was told to not allow that. And then it turns out, we don't know, right? The different intelligence agencies in the U.S. Same thing with the COVID vaccine, it's safe. Oh, well, wait a minute. It turns out it causes an increased amount of myocarditis in young men. But we still think the benefits outweigh it. And I'm not arguing with that. I'm saying, though, is where do you draw the line? And the elites should not be in control of what other people say. And it is complicated in one sense, it's simple in another, right? That we let the marketplace of ideas work things out. There's some caveats on there. You can sue people for defamation, and some of the people, for instance, Rudolph Giuliani, in the whole 2020 election, had a very large judgments put against him. So that process does work, but it takes some effort, and it should be something more than just the White House calling up and threatening Mark Zuckerberg.
Andre, what's interesting is the Trump administration, or even the Trump campaign at one point, was like, this isn't working for us. You know what? Let's create our own social media operation. Let's go out there and have an operation that hopefully we get it large enough, we get our messaging the way that we want it to be. I mean, is that basically what we're looking at, that we need to just let these private sector entities slug it out and the winner, gets the spoils, per se? Or is there something where the government does have a responsibility to step in and try to make sure to some degree that the information that's going out in the public square has some modicum of truth?
Yeah, I think I'm the only one on the panel that's actually been suspended by Facebook for making a COVID-related post. Well, actually, it wasn't even a post. It was a comment in jest about being a Chinese guy eating a bat. And my account was immediately suspended for 1 week. And actually, we discovered that it was done because it was done so quickly that it wasn't done by a human, but by a robot. I violated the community standards through the algorithm. But ultimately, on one hand, Facebook, social media, Facebook, Twitter X, TikTok, these companies are private enterprises, private companies. They're entitled to set their own content moderation policies, community standards, in terms of use. Their sandbox, their rules. But yet on the other hand, and this goes to Dr. Golden's point, these platforms are now part of the public trust. A majority of Americans do get their information from social media, and intended or not, social media influences American culture, the economy, and even elections. So these companies wield enormous power over us. Zuckerberg said he created Facebook as a way to just connect with friends, share family photos, announce major life events, engage in the proverbial water cooler gossip. Not anymore.
This bat eating joke side of you is a side we don't see enough of on this show. I just like to see more of that side of your persona.
Well, Tim Golden, what I'm trying to figure out is where do you draw the line here? McDonald's is a major organization that goes out and tell you that you should come and eat breakfast with us every day. Our food is great. Oh, by the way, we call it a Happy Meal. And, but in the same breath, we're saying that there are other major corporations that because they seem to do a better job of touching the community, that there needs to be some policing that takes place there. It almost seems like there needs to be policing of the people who are reading all of this stuff, that they should take some time to kind of do their own parsing on their own? Or are we just simply saying, well, folk will just never do that, so we got to come in and do it for them?
Yeah, well, one of the problems is, you've asked this question, where do you draw the line? And, Todd gave the example of Rudy Giuliani. I think you could certainly draw the line there, right? Despite what social media may or may not have said about him. The fact is that Rudy Giuliani deteriorated from tough federal prosecutor who took down the New York mob, America's mayor, courageous survivor of prostate cancer. Now his name is basically a punchline, right? And we got to that point because we know what's true and what's false, and there are still ways to check that through the judiciary, right? You have to file lawsuits and so forth, but you can draw the line there. I also think that it's one thing to say that we don't know if COVID was created in a lab or whether it wasn't, but it's another thing to push cockamamie theories about treatments for COVID that are clearly not good ways to approach the disease, right? So we can't abandon our common sense. And some of the responsibility has to be on we who consume this stuff to sort of filter out what's true and what's false. But in the end, I think the biggest problem we have is that journalism has ceased to be what it is. When I was a kid growing up in the 70s in Philadelphia, you had 3 news stations, and you had people like Walter Cronkite and or Peter Jennings, and we trusted certain people to give us the news. Nowadays, any nitwit with a microphone and enough followers on YouTube can be popular and can also be dead wrong at the same time. But we've allowed popularity to eclipse truth. And I think we have to figure out for ourselves as we consume social media what's true and what's false. And we have to remember that the judiciary is the last bastion that we have to help vindicate what's true from what's false and to bring consequences for pushing false ideas.
Well, I'm going to let that be the last word, but I think really the idea of freedom from a Christian's perspective as it relates to speech is something that we've got to be steadfast and fight to the nth degree. Because even though we've got these social media platforms that sometimes can maybe take us awry, we don't want to make sure that we're stifling it in a way where we're not allowing individuals from a religious perspective to be able to engage in proselytization if that's what they choose. There's an interesting case called Kuilema versus Calvin University. And for those of you who are unaware, Calvin University is a world-class Christian university in Grand Rapids, Michigan. And that university seeks to prepare students to engage in a world through faith, curiosity, and conviction. And to accomplish this goal, Calvin asks its administrators and its professors to uphold its beliefs in word and in deed. However, not too long ago, one of its professors decided that he was going to engage in an activity, and as a result thereof, ended up suing the university that he was actually being discriminated against. This professor actually went to officiate a same-sex marriage, and as a result of that officiating of that particular event, he and the university, they talked a little bit, they went back and forth, and they actually found themselves saying, you know what, we cannot be on the same page, and they decided not to renew his contract. But an interesting part of the whole concept was that the university says that it does allow for some personal disagreements with church teachings. You know, Todd, when we take a look at some of these situations here as it relates to cases regarding how you need to operate within religious institutions that are affiliated with churches, it makes me a little bit uncomfortable when someone says, some of this personal stuff we can basically, wink at, but there are other things that, it's the line in the sand. You know, when I see a case like this, how do I know where that line in the sand is supposed to be? Especially when some of the specific requirements of your church may be a little bit nebulous at best.
So the answer is, if you're part of that community, you generally have an idea of where the line is. And that's going to be up to discretion of the university to decide. And that will change over time. That's the nature of faith institutions. But all faiths have some level of ambiguity or disagreement that we in the Seventh-day Adventist Church have had some of those. Some of them, like there was a big debate in the early 20th century on the daily, which is a reference in the Bible. It's one that doesn't even really exist anymore, but that was a huge point of contention. And so allowing for some discussion, but there's also certain issues that are settled. For instance, the divinity of Christ. If you don't believe in that, how can you even be Christian? That is a settled question. It was debated early on in Christian history, but settled. And so I do think a university and a religious community has a right to set boundaries. And just like with the law, those boundaries are not always 100% clear. We pass laws that say, that you have to act reasonably. Well, what is reasonably? Well, that's not perfectly defined, but yet we still allow that in law, and we should allow faith communities that same leeway.
Right, I agree, and whether you're looking at this from an employment-based perspective or religious-based perspective, I think the law sides with the university here. In employment law, one of the fundamental duties that employees owe to the employer is the duty to obey. That the employer sets the scope in terms of employment, everything from dress requirements to codes of conduct is set by the employer. Employee has to follow that. But also, as a religious institution, the university has the freedom to ensure that those who teach its tenets and beliefs to students upholds and models its tenets and beliefs. So, and additionally, Supreme Court has a long history of holding that the courts stay out of matters of church governance, faith, and doctrine. So I think on both counts, on an employment-based and religious-based approach, the law falls on the side of Calvin University.
Well, apart even from the law here, right? It's this question of, did this professor know that in this he was violating Calvin's policies? And the answer is almost certainly yes, right? This is just an obvious, don't ever do this. And he probably had all kinds of advance notice, and he chose to do it anyway. Now, I support his right of conscience to do that. I think the federal government or any other government should punish him for doing that. But he doesn't have a right to work in an institution. It's a religious institution that has a very different conclusion about what that is. You see what I'm saying? So I just think that I don't feel particularly sorry for this gentleman. I would invite him. Presumably, he got a job at Calvin. He's a talented individual. He can get a job teaching at an institution that shares his beliefs about that, although there are a declining number of those institutions because those religious organizations are shrinking.
Well, Tim Golden, I got an interesting question on this along the lines of, where would the line have been drawn? Say, for example, he wasn't officiating, but just simply attended. I had a father who had a belief that you should go to no marriage ceremony unless you were completely comfortable with everything and everybody there. So the idea that you actually would attend something like that in large part could be really viewed as being, well, this is something that you are comfortable with, and as a result thereof, that's a violation. So my question is, I get the officiating part, but it seems to me we could come really far down the line on this, and apparently he's suing based on a specific statute in Michigan, and I'm wondering how we may end up, justifying some of these actions down the road.
Well, I think that if this faculty member attended the wedding, he would be on much firmer ground, right? It's an argument that, hey, look, this is a friend of mine. If I'm a Christian, I'm going to be a friend. And if I'm going to be a friend, I'm going to support the people who are engaged in this, although I may disagree with them. I don't think Calvin University would have had a problem with that. But the open violation of a policy to which he consented, right, contractually in working there, I think is where you have to draw the line. As soon as you hear a faculty member in a university, a lot of people have knee-jerk reactions and go to academic freedom. This is not a case about academic freedom, right? Mm-hmm. It's not about something he was teaching in the classroom. It's about a personal conduct policy engaged in outside of the classroom. So again, just to agree with all the other panelists here, the university is on firm footing here. And I think this is something that was done perhaps in open violation of the policy to see how far he could go. But I don't think he's going to get very far with this. And again, I think the university is probably on pretty firm ground here.
Yeah, there's another pretty interesting wrinkle here, Orlin, is that you mentioned this lawsuit was brought under a state statute. That state law, that LGBT non-discrimination law, passed just in the last couple of years. Mm-hmm. But before it had passed, a decade ago, a conservative Republican Speaker of the House had brought forward a so-called balanced proposal to protect LGBT people from discrimination, but also to protect institutions like Calvin quite explicitly. And a lot of people said, well, we don't want to do this because this is giving away too much. But it turns out, had that law passed 10 years ago, Calvin would have really probably never even been sued because there would have been no basis to sue them. So when the legislature changed hands about 3 years ago, they instantaneously passed a law more along the lines of the Federal Equality Act that really treats religion quite badly. And so that's kind of where they stand. Now, I do think Calvin is still going to win because I think the Constitution is pretty clear. And, you know, there are First Amendment constitutional protections that I think are going to, you know, be used here. But I also think that this may have been avoided if there had been more prudence a decade ago by people who saw these kinds of things coming.
You know, Todd, as somebody who has to advise a lot of these organizations that are affiliated with churches, are you finding now that maybe some of these handbooks and requirements need to be more specific, or the idea of leaving it maybe a little bit more vague may be, you know, the way to go, just simply because, you know, being more vague may give you more flexibility, but it does seem like we're getting so many nuanced activities on what some may seem as being common sense, you know, and something that should have been obvious. I don't know if you can actually put that on everyone nowadays.
Yeah, the advice that we generally give these institutions for handbooks is they should lay out the rules, in a level of specificity that fairly lets people know what to do, but you can't contemplate every situation, right? Famously, there was a Seinfeld episode in which George engaged in inappropriate conduct in his office with a cleaning staff. And he says, was that wrong? You know, and yes, in fact, there probably wasn't an HR manual prohibiting exactly what he did, but it was pretty common sense. And I think that's where universities are. In this particular situation, it wasn't just a same-sex couple, it was a trans same-sex couple. So you put that on top of it. And, you know, I've not seen any of these situations where they're really truly the person was like, wait a minute, could truly say that they didn't know what they were doing was wrong.
I watched that episode of Seinfeld last night.
Wow. The Holy Spirit is really at play here, gentlemen.
Well, you know, Andre, when you're out there advising and you're in a part of the country that I would say may be considered to be a little bit more liberal and more secular in terms of how these views are operating, you know, we're looking at an institution here in Michigan. If I was looking at an institution that may have been a little bit more on, I'll just call it the left side of the country, could we have possibly seen something a little bit different? Because what's interesting is the idea is from time to time, there's some personal things that we can work out that may not be exactly on point. But that's the nuance that I think people try to drive the truck through. Either got to be hard and fast, and this is how we're going to play. But if it becomes murky in any way, it seems like it's reasonable some people may try to drive a truck through things.
Right. Not only are we a worldwide church, but even in North America, we have a range of viewpoint. And Todd's correct. I mean, you can't over codify every situation. And to quote Justice Potter Stewart in a famous quote, he said, you know it when you see it. And in this case, the professor at Calvin, he actually said, I was not there in my capacity as a professor. I was not there in my capacity as an employee of Calvin University. I was there as myself as a licensed minister. Well, that's exactly it. He's a licensed minister who solemnized the marriage in his official capacity. So when you elevate it and escalate it to that level, then I think that's where it triggers this employment issue for this professor.
I would just say from George and the cleaning lady to Potter Stewart in the context of the quote. This has been a real PG-13 segment.
There you go.
I would also point out, it wasn't just two people he was doing a wedding for. They were two former students. So trying to say this wasn't his capacity as a professor, these weren't family members, right? These were former students.
Right.
Well, and I think at the end of the day, you mentioned family members, Todd. When you start bringing that, were you officiating family member, I think it gets even more complicated. But I'll just simply say this. The idea of what's considered to be common sense from a religious standpoint, we may have to walk that back in a long ways going forward. Because at this point in time, I don't think you can consider anything to be common sense when you're now fighting about the ideas of faith and politics. Tim Schultz, tell me something I don't know.
It was George Costanza who offered one of the great ethical delineations for when something is or is not a lie. According to George, it's not a lie if you believe it.
Tim Golden, tell me something I don't know.
The phrase race-conscious textualism seems to be oxymoronic by today's contemporary legal standard. But that was exactly Frederick Douglass's approach that led him to the conclusion that the Constitution of the United States was, quote, a glorious liberty document.
Andre, tell me something I don't know.
Well, speaking of John Calvin died in Geneva on May 27, 1564, and wanted no memorialization of his life. He didn't want pilgrims traveling to Geneva to find his grave. So to this day, no one knows where John Calvin is buried.
Wow. Todd, tell me something I don't know.
The Elliott-Larsen Act that we made reference to earlier is named after a Republican and Democrat who helped to get it passed in 1976 and got the bill named after themselves for that.
Wow, good work. Gentlemen, great conversation today. Really looking forward to doing this again. And thanks again for you being here with us. Hope you enjoyed our conversation. Just remember, if it's about God and government, it's faith and politics. See you next time.